It was no mistake that God gave Joseph the two visions about the wheat, where he was a bundle of wheat and the others were bowing down to him, about the stars, where he was the one in charge and his brothers bowed down to him. There was no mistake when God gave him those visions, knowing that he would talk about it to his older brothers, knowing that his older brothers would be jealous of him, knowing that his older brothers would finally be done with Joseph talking about ruling over them and would imprison him in a pit and sell him to travelers going by to Egypt. It's no mistake that God used the wickedness in their hearts in order to accomplish his purposes. It's no mistake that Joseph had the blessing of God in order to gain the favor of Potiphar and the Pharaoh and be put over all of the things in Egypt regarding the famine that was coming. It's no mistake that Joseph was able to accumulate enough food to last through the famine and also to spare his own family and for them to come down to Egypt. It's no mistake that God arranged those things by setting it up and allowing it to happen based on men's choices, that he predicted himself because of the character of those men. And it came to pass. Now, they were not immediately enslaved. It wasn't until a new king arose who didn't know who Joseph was after Joseph died. They didn't know who Joseph had been. He didn't know. And so then he looked, and here are the Hebrews, and they're numerous. They're having babies everywhere. And there's so many of them that the Egyptians were afraid that they might side with the Egyptians' enemies and fight against them. And so they started enslaving them. And the more that they persecuted them, it says, the more they multiplied. The more they were persecuted by Pharaoh, the more the Hebrews had sex, had children, and multiplied. Interesting. I'm going to read to you the transition between Genesis and Exodus. It's just a few paragraphs, but it's very interesting. And you'll hear this. It says, and after he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt. Who is Joseph's father? Jacob, Israel. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt. He buried him in Canaan, where he promised to. He and his brothers and all who went up with him to bury his father. So they all went up. And they returned to Egypt. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. Even his brothers called what they did evil. So there's no doubt about it. It was evil. So they sent messengers to Joseph saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespasses of your brothers, the trespass of your brothers and their sin. So Jacob also, Israel also acknowledged it as sin, for they did evil to you. So Jacob recognized that what the brothers did was evil, sin. The brothers recognized that what they did was evil. Then the brothers say, now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Joseph wept when his brothers spoke these things to him. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we are your servants. It's exactly what God gave him the visions of, the dreams. They, it says right here, Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we are your servants. And at that moment, those two dreams were fulfilled. Joseph said to them, Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me. So Joseph also called it evil. Their intentions, he doesn't talk about the actions, he talks about the intentions here. He says, You meant evil for me, against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Who was it who betrayed Jesus? Judas. Who was it who handed Jesus over to be bound, to be beaten, to have a crown of thorns put on his head, with the thorns making him bleed? Who betrayed him into that? To be beaten, to be whipped, to be put on the cross? Judas. But it resulted in our salvation. Judas meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Another parallel. In order to bring about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Interesting. He did not treat them as slaves. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. A little short for that time. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation, the children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. So, hold on a minute. You got to consider this a minute. Ephraim was his son. He saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. 1, 2, 3. Wow! Not just his grandchildren, not just his great-grandchildren, but his great-great-grandchildren. Now, I knew my great-grandmother. I had met both of my great-grandmothers, but one of them I actually lived with in high school. So I knew down to the second generation. I was the second generation below my great-grandmother, I guess. Let's see. Great-grandmother, below her would be my grandmother, my father, and me. So, all right, so it's like great-grandparents. Okay? Because this was Ephraim, 3 generations below Ephraim. So that would be great-great-grandparents. All right, so great-great-grandchild. Joseph saw his great-great-grandchild. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here, which they did. So Joseph died being 110 years old. So he was 110 years old. And they embalmed him. Interesting. And he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Very specific. Watch what happens. That's the end of Genesis. That's how it ends. Now, these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man and his household came with Jacob. I'm not going to read all of it, okay? But I'm going to go ahead down here. It says, and Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. They were everywhere in Egypt. Now there arose a king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Remember, Joseph, his brothers, and all that generation died off. And this new king over Egypt did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. There are more Hebrews than Egyptians in Egypt at that point. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happened in the event of war that they also, it says, lest they multiply, and it happened in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. The more they afflicted the Hebrews, the more they multiplied and grew. The more they had sex, they had babies, they had children, they had families, and they grew under affliction. If you think that because of a time of affliction, it's not a time to have children, the Bible says the opposite. That's exactly the time to have children. That's when they grew the most. That's when their people grew the most, was under affliction. So, for example, here in Ukraine, they're under the affliction of the Russian invasion. It is not the time to stop having children. It's the time to have more children. That's what it says right here in the Bible. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor because they were multiplying even greater under the persecution. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. It's funny in English, isn't it? It's like the sound when you spit something out of your mouth, Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of the midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, you shall kill him, and if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God. Interesting. The midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. It's a very funny thing, yeah? Okay. Therefore God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. The midwives were usually not married, didn't have children. But God provided for them their own households because they feared God and refused to murder those male babies. It's a great, great story. A great record of what God did. A great record of the result of fearing God. May the Lord bless you as you seek him with all your heart.